A squat machine trundles through the smoke, tracks churning mud like a farmer late for harvest. It is neither tank nor truck, but something that insists on being both the men inside trust it as much as they mistrust the landscape, which is to say, just enough. The universal carrier was Britain's answer to every question it could not yet afford to solve. It was built to carry guns, men, messages, and occasionally luck. Light, noisy, and absurdly useful, it became the single most common armoured vehicle of the Second World War, proof that sometimes small things win simply by showing up everywhere. Before the war began, the British Army found itself stranded between centuries. It had engines, yes, but too few wheels to match its ambitions. The memory of horse and trench still lingered, yet the promise of speed had crept into military thought, like electricity into a candle-lit room. The old world moved on hooves. The new one demanded tracks. By the late 1930s, every strategist could see that firepower meant little if it couldn't be moved quickly. Armies had learned that defence without mobility was simply waiting to be surrounded. Britain's industrial planners, never short of spreadsheets or tea, realised that an affordable vehicle able to cross mud, rubble and barbed wire would give its infantry the pace they lacked. The challenge was that Britain didn't want another tank. It needed something far humbler, a machine that would ferry men and munitions to the front without bankrupting the empire. The result had to be simple enough for car factories, reliable enough for privates, and small enough to fit on a railway wagon. Out of this arithmetic emerged an unlikely equation: power plus lightness equals survival. Early in the decade, the Carden-Lloyd carriers had already hinted at the idea. They were open-topped, noisy, and fond of breaking down in the rain, but they worked. What the generals noticed was not their strength, but their shape. A low-slung frame, thin armour, tracks that could turn inside their own length. It was a concept that could multiply itself. The idea wasn't to dominate the battlefield, it was to populate it. Britain's thinking men, and a few who simply refused to sit still, began to imagine a force where every squad had its own mechanical legs. They wanted a chassis that could carry a Bren gun, a radio, or a mortar, depending on the morning's orders. This machine would not be heroic, it would be helpful, and for an army that spent more time waiting than charging, that was no small thing. The War Office's requests were astonishingly practical. No turrets, no grandstanding, just a 40-horsepower engine, thin steel plates, and room for 3 men and a weapon. They were not building a knight in armour. They were building the horse. By 1939, factories from Birmingham to Dagenham were sketching the future in rivets and grease pencil. The carrier's birth was not a moment of revelation, but a steady accumulation of common sense. Its purpose was everywhere: to haul supplies, to tow guns, to move the wounded, to let infantry keep up with tanks without asking for one. If the British Army had been a sentence, the universal carrier was the comma, small, unnoticed, but it made the whole thing flow. It arrived not to inspire, but to connect, man to machine, rifle to road, and command to chaos. What began as an answer to logistical frustration would soon become an icon of industrial pragmatism, the humblest outline on the battlefield, destined to appear on every front where a soldier needed to move and couldn't afford to walk. Every invention begins with an argument, and in the mid-30s, Britain's engineers were having a polite one. What should a mechanized army actually look like? Some said it would be dominated by towering tanks. Others imagined columns of lorries, but a few quietly insisted that the real power would lie somewhere in between, in something that could crawl, carry and disappear when required. The men behind this line of thought were designers like Sir John Carden and Vivian Lloyd, civilian minds working in the industrial grammar of war. They understood that simplicity was its own armour. Each new drawing they produced made the machine smaller, the mechanics fewer, and the maintenance easier. The concept was to replace mass with movement. When the War Office formalised its carrier idea, it was not demanding a vehicle of prestige, but of ubiquity. It wanted something that could be built by firms that normally made saloon cars and tractor parts. That constraint, oddly, became the carrier's strength. It was designed to be ordinary, which, in wartime, Britain was the most extraordinary thing imaginable. The vision was economical rather than emotional. The universal carrier was meant to be the lowest common denominator of mechanized warfare, a standard hull, standard tracks. The rest, adaptable engineers could bolt on a Bren gun, a boy's anti-tank rifle, or a pair of stretchers without redesigning the blueprint. It was a kit more than a vehicle, a rolling compromise between imagination and production quotas. In technical terms, it reflected a shift in British doctrine. After the lessons of the Great War, planners realised that versatility would beat variety. One adaptable chassis could do the job of 5 specialised ones. The new carriers, therefore, were not classified by what they did, but by what they might do next. They were powered by Ford's 85 horsepower V8 engine, a piece of civilian engineering drafted reluctantly into military service. It was a car engine, and proud of it, loud, dependable, and easily replaced. The carrier's track system was narrow, its armour thin, but its mobility astonishing. It could ford streams, mount curbs, and reverse into positions that made lorry drivers go pale. Inside, conditions were intimate. Crews sat shoulder to shoulder, knees wedged against ammunition boxes, the exhaust note rumbling beneath their boots. It was less like driving a vehicle, and more like sitting inside a decision someone else had just made. Yet soldiers adored it. It gave them motion, cover, and a faint illusion of safety, 3 commodities in constant short supply. To the generals, the carrier embodied a doctrine: speed over splendour, numbers over nuance. To the troops, it became a companion, a mobile trench that arrived when called and sulked when ignored. The vision, then, was not of glory, but of utility. The universal carrier would never conquer a battlefield by itself, but it would make sure someone else could. By the eve of war, the plan was set. Britain would fight not with giants, but with swarms, and leading that quiet revolution was a vehicle so small that it almost looked embarrassed to be noticed, until you realised it was everywhere. Once the blueprints were fixed, the real test began, not on the battlefield, but in the factories. Britain's workshops had to turn sketches into steel at a pace faster than common sense. In an age when every rivet had to justify its existence, the universal carrier was an engineer's dream, mostly flat panels, no turret, and just enough complexity to keep the foreman awake. The first production runs began in 1937 at Vickers Armstrong. Within months, Ford at Dagenham and the Canadian plant at Windsor joined in. It was mass production by persuasion, car workers suddenly building armour instead of radiators, tradesmen learning that a half-inch of steel could behave like an opinion, hard to bend once it's formed. The simplicity was deliberate. Each panel could be cut on existing presses, each component shared with civilian vehicles. Bolts, bearings, even light fittings came from shelves that yesterday served motorcars. The carrier didn't require secret alloys or mystical craftsmanship. It relied on the very ordinariness of British industry. Its genius was that it could be built by anyone who could tighten a nut without dropping it. Yet, simplicity hides its own precision. The hull plates needed to be exact, the bogies aligned within fractions of an inch, or the track would leap off under stress. Workers adapted, measuring with the kind of focus that made their tea go cold. In Dagenham, lines of half-finished hulls stretched into the gloom, each smelling of oil, hot steel, and quiet panic. The Ford V8 engines arrived by train, stacked like artillery shells. They were civilian at heart, which meant they had personalities. Some purred, others coughed like smokers. Mechanics learned quickly that if one refused to start, you spoke to it nicely once, then replaced it. This wasn't sentimentality, it was survival. Every completed chassis rolled through inspection yards where its tracks clattered over concrete, a sound that became the unofficial anthem of wartime production. Children living nearby could tell the difference between a universal carrier being tested and a lorry by ear alone. The carrier was higher-pitched, impatient, almost eager to escape the yard. Canada soon eclipsed Britain's output, turning out tens of thousands under license. Their factories had space, resources, and fewer bombers overhead. When American inspectors saw the process, they were baffled by its speed. No mystique, no slogans, just lines of riveters, welders, and clerks turning raw metal into movement. What made the build remarkable wasn't innovation, but discipline. Britain's engineers had discovered that a simple machine could be infinitely complex to produce well. Every misdrilled hole meant a delay, every delay a weapon not delivered. And still, production grew, from hundreds to thousands, then into six figures that seemed almost unreal. It was the kind of miracle that didn't look like one. Men in flat caps, women in overalls, and a machine that multiplied itself until even its creators lost count. The universal carrier wasn't forged in a burst of inspiration. It was assembled in patience, rhythm, and repetition. And when the last rivet cooled, Britain possessed something rare, a machine that could be everywhere at once, built by everyone who cared enough to get it right. Every machine eventually meets the truth of its design. For the universal carrier, that truth came in the form of mud, gradients, and the sheer unpredictability of human enthusiasm. Trials began in peacetime, under the polite skies of England, where officers watched as mechanics threw the little vehicle into ditches, rivers, and fields to see what would break first, the steel or the crew's optimism. The results were almost reassuring. The carrier climbed, swam, and turned with the kind of stubbornness only British machinery could manage. It was quick across grass, steady on gravel, and hopeless in sand, though it refused to admit it. Engineers noted that when bogged down, it simply needed more throttle and less conversation. The manuals described this as driver initiative, which was military code for guessing. By 1939, exercises across Salisbury Plain showed that the carrier could deliver infantry to positions with alarming speed squads, who once marched for hours now arrived winded only from excitement. It could ferry a machine gun team, tow a small gun, or drag wounded men back from the line. And despite its open top and wafer-thin armour, soldiers began to treat it like a shield with wheels. Then came real battle. France, 1940, the carrier's debut under fire. It moved among retreating columns, carrying what was left of cohesion. Drivers learned to weave through chaos, engines whining beneath overloaded hulls. Some carriers were abandoned and burned. Others made it to the beaches, half full of ammunition, half of disbelief. They were not designed for miracles, but occasionally performed them out of sheer mechanical obstinacy. In North Africa, the desert rewrote every assumption. The heat warped armour plates, fine sand invaded gearboxes, and the flat horizon punished even the best engines. Crews improvised sunshades from ration tins, wrapped scarves around carburetors, and discovered that the machine's worst habit, overheating, was also its most predictable. They learned to stop before it boiled, much as one stops before insulting an officer, out of experience, not affection. Still, it endured. The carrier carried, endlessly, faithfully, in every role its designers could imagine, and a few they would rather not know about. Mortar carriers, flamethrower variants, ambulance conversions, each improvised and field-tested in the most direct way possible. Try it once and see if anyone survives to report. Reports came back with grudging praise. The steering was sharp, the visibility excellent, the comfort non-existent. Crews joked that it gave them a fine view of everything trying to kill them. But they trusted it because it was predictable, the one British trait that occasionally wins wars. By 1943, the universal carrier had become as common as boots. In Sicily, Italy, and the jungles of Burma, it appeared in photographs as background furniture to history, towing guns up beaches, threading between palm trees, always busy, never glamorous. Its test was never a single event. It was a million small experiments in movement and survival. The carrier did not pass those tests with honours. It passed them by refusing to stop. By 1942, the universal carrier had stopped being an experiment and started being unavoidable. Every unit wanted them, every depot was short of them, and every battlefield had one rusting quietly somewhere in a hedge. Its breakthrough wasn't a moment of triumph, it was the slow, unstoppable migration from the edges of strategy to its centre. The Army discovered that wherever the carrier went, plans became easier to write: reconnaissance, resupply, communication, all suddenly mobile. In an army famous for paperwork, this was progress bordering on the miraculous. The machine had turned logistics into a conversation rather than an argument. It gave every commander a simple promise: you could now reach the front without walking there. The breakthrough was practical, not romantic. Units began using them for everything except what they were designed for. In the desert, they scouted. In Italy, they carried prisoners. In Burma, they hauled rations through jungle mud so thick it swallowed mules whole. When asked what the carrier couldn't do, one officer replied, "Float," then hesitated, remembering someone had already tried that. Its flexibility came at a cost. Armour-piercing rounds ignored it, mortars terrified it, and anything larger than a pothole could ruin its day. Crews knew it too, which gave the machine a reputation for bravery it never asked for. Courage, in this case, was simply persistence with a gearbox. Still, numbers told the truth. Over 100,000 were built, more than any other armoured vehicle of the war. Nations borrowed the design, retooled it, renamed it. The Canadians produced their own by the tens of thousands. The Soviets received them by the shipload. Even the Americans, armed with their jeeps and half-tracks, found the little British box unexpectedly useful. It was during these years that the carrier's weaknesses became part of its myth. Soldiers accepted that it wouldn't stop a bullet, but it would get them there before the bullet arrived. It wasn't protection, it was proximity. It filled the distance between man and machine, between plan and reality. In occupied Europe, it became a symbol of arrival. When Allied units rolled through liberated villages, it was usually a carrier in front, small enough to fit the streets, low enough for children to climb. Photos show them surrounded by civilians, the soldiers looking vaguely bewildered at their sudden popularity. It was not a glamorous machine, but it looked human, compact, practical, imperfect. The carrier's quiet victory was consistency. It kept working when others broke. Crews learned its sounds, the polite chatter of track links, the metallic sigh before a gear slipped, and listened for them, the way sailors listen for weather. It didn't inspire confidence so much as remind you there was still something to rely on. By the time victory approached, the universal carrier had crossed deserts, jungles, rivers, and philosophies. It had not changed the nature of war, but it had changed the tempo. It was the rhythm section of the Allied advance, steady, unglamorous, indispensable. When a design succeeds too well, it stops belonging to its maker. The universal carrier proved that rule with quiet efficiency. By 1943, it was not so much a British vehicle as a shared accent spoken across armies. Every ally built or borrowed it. Every theatre gave it a new job and a new name. Through Lend-Lease, thousands were shipped east to the Soviet Union. There, in snow and ash, they hauled supplies through forests where even tanks hesitated. The Russians nicknamed it simply the English tractor. It lacked glamour, but it moved, and that was enough. In a land where perfection froze, usefulness was a form of heroism. In India and the Middle East, the carriers became meeting points between worlds. Photographs show them surrounded by curious locals, their crews chatting as if the war were merely an interruption in the day's heat. The machine, in its blunt practicality, had become a kind of translator, metal explaining empire to itself. The hidden consequence of the carrier's simplicity was that it could not stay military forever. When armies demobilized, civilians took note, farmers saw a tool, loggers a workhorse, explorers a promise. Tracks designed for battlefields began pulling plows, ambulances, even carnival rides. In Canada, veterans bought surplus carriers at auction and converted them into snow vehicles. Somewhere in that transformation, war quietly lost its grip on the design. Politically, the carrier also changed expectations. It proved that industrial nations could build armoured mobility by the 100,000, not by the 100. That lesson did not vanish with victory. It became doctrine for the Cold War. Every post-war personnel carrier, from Britain's own F-5 series to Soviet troop transports, owed a debt to this unassuming box of steel. Economically, it left another legacy. The factories that had learned to produce carriers on automotive lines did not stop. When peace returned, those same lines built tractors, lorries, and construction equipment. A generation of workers had been trained in the art of precision on something that looked nothing like peace, and that skill rebuilt the civilian world faster than politicians could plan it. There was also a quieter cost. In being so common, the carrier blurred the moral outlines of industrial war. A machine that could be turned into anything made killing feel procedural. Almost administrative crews remembered it fondly. Historians found it unsettling. The very ordinariness that had saved lives also made destruction efficient. Even after the guns fell silent, surplus carriers rolled on, in Korea, in colonial emergencies, in half-forgotten conflicts that never made the newsreels. Some survived into the 1960s, repainted, rearmed, and half believed to be new inventions. They weren't. They were echoes, still clattering forward on habits learned in another decade. The hidden consequence of success is permanence. The universal carrier had been built to solve one problem. It quietly influenced 3 generations of solutions that followed. Its tracks, once meant for mud and war, now marked the long road between necessity and memory. After the war, the universal carrier faced an unfamiliar opponent: redundancy. The front had vanished, the empire was shrinking, and its purpose dissolved overnight. Thousands of them sat in depots, engines ticking softly as if still expecting orders. Some were scrapped, some sold, others simply forgotten under tarpaulins, waiting for someone to decide what victory meant in peacetime. But the carrier had never been sentimental. Its shape, designed for utility, proved impossible to retire. Farmers converted them into tractors. Fire brigades found that a tracked vehicle could reach places a lorry could not. Explorers in the Arctic stripped off the armour and discovered a perfect snow machine. Even film crews used them as mobile cameras before the word documentary had grown respectable. In museums, the survivors tell another story. Visitors often assume they're small tanks, until the guide points out there's no turret, just space for 3 men and a purpose. That modesty is what kept them alive. They required no myth to justify their existence, only fuel and an idea of motion. Few machines have been so useful and so completely unpretentious about it. Technically, the Carrier influenced an entire generation of post-war vehicles. The British F-5 1611 and the American M39 borrowed its philosophy of simplicity. Even modern armoured personnel carriers trace their lineage back to this modest frame. Flat armour, rear engine, front crew compartment, the same logic, written in thicker metal. The Carrier had set the template for mechanised infantry transport before anyone thought to name it. Collectors and restorers later found that, compared to other wartime relics, the universal carrier aged with dignity, its rivets still tight, its gearbox still eager, its suspension still willing to remind the driver what every pebble feels like. Restoring one is less archaeology than conversation, each bolt unscrewing with the sigh of recognition. Yet its afterlife isn't just mechanical. The Carrier lingered in memory because it embodied a kind of national temperament, workmanlike, adaptable, a little too loud, but always on time. It didn't win wars on its own, it simply refused to make them harder. In that sense, it was Britain in miniature. Not glorious but necessary around the world, monuments sometimes place one on a plinth beside the names of infantry regiments. The contrast is striking, a humble machine commemorated for doing what it was built to do. Endure, no marble required. Today, when enthusiasts drive restored Carriers across grass at country shows, crowds hear the same high-pitched engine note that once echoed through ruined towns. Children climb aboard. Veterans nod quietly. There's recognition in that sound, not of power, but of persistence. The Carrier's legacy isn't that it survived war, it's that it never stopped being useful, even after war no longer was. Every machine leaves an echo, and the universal carrier's is faint but constant. You can still hear it in museums, where its thin armour pings lightly under fingertips, and in the workshops, where restorers coax its engine back to life with gestures learned from grandparents. It no longer belongs to history. It belongs to anyone who understands the sound of effort. Time has been unusually kind to it. Most vehicles of its generation ended up as scrap or silence, yet this one keeps returning in restored columns and private collections, a small defiance against forgetfulness. Its survival is not nostalgia, but curiosity, a collective desire to understand why something so modest refused to disappear. Look closely at its form, and you see the logic of its century. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative. The open top admits wind and weather, the armour stops only the smallest of fates, and yet the shape feels honest. There is no illusion of grandeur, just a promise of work. That quality made it useful then and endearing now. When it moves today, it does so cautiously, tracks pressing against grass rather than rubble. Spectators smile at the noise, the brisk chatter of a small V8 engine, but the sound has lost its menace. It hums like an old typewriter still capable of a good sentence. What the Carrier represented was not invention, but intention. It embodied an age that believed progress could be mass-produced if the design was simple enough. The war proved that idea both right and wrong. The universal carrier helped armies move faster and also helped them learn how easy movement could be, that knowledge shaped not just how wars were fought, but how industries thought about the people inside their machines. Its descendants still patrol the modern world, heavier, sealed, digital, yet they carry the same basic outline: mobility before comfort, function before pride. The carrier's shadow runs beneath them, a reminder that technology is most humane when it refuses to be heroic. If you stand beside one today, cold steel warming in sunlight, it feels oddly alive, a machine that never stopped working, just changed jobs. The soldiers it once carried are mostly gone. The earth it once crossed has long since grown quiet. And yet, each time the engine turns over, the past tightens a loose bolt somewhere in the present. The universal carrier began as a temporary solution, and somehow became permanent. In the long story of war machines, that may be the closest thing to peace it ever achieved.